Today I'm going to talk about common Sitecore architecture pitfalls, many based on mistakes I've made or witnessed firsthand, sometimes mistakes I've made multiple times. While I may have recommendations and approaches for mitigating some of these, my goal is to get you thinking and looking around corners. But first, a little about me. Yes, those are my kids, 6 boys, and we finally got the girl. I'm a technology MVP, mostly for my work in open source. I built Sitecore Foundation, which was a fully featured open source Sitecore development accelerator that I've been slowly breaking apart into independent modules and integrating with XXA where I can. You can find them on my GitHub or keep tabs on things on my blog or Twitter account. I'm a director at Proficient who spends most of my time envisioning, estimating, and overseeing Sitecore projects. I've been architecting Sitecore solutions for the past 7 years and building ASP.NET applications for almost 20. I've worked on a lot of Sitecore projects for a lot of clients with a lot of developers and architects with strong opinions. These are mine. Pitfall number 1, ignoring best practices. But who doesn't like best practices, you might ask? I remember when Helix first came out, I was actually pretty resistant. My first version of Sitecore Foundation was pretty monolithic. I had maybe 5 Visual Studio projects as you typically did before Helix, and things were definitely not built as modular as they could have been. When Helix and Habitat came out, and I saw how many projects Habitat had, it was a lot to process. I remember writing a pretty long post on my company's internal Yammer at the time, saying it was overkill and arguing that you can still manage dependencies properly without that level of granularity in your Visual Studio projects. Eventually, I attended one of those Helix workshops and began to refactor Sitecore Foundation into the feature and foundational modules it has today. Going through that is what made me a believer, as I got to see the benefits of the separation. I've taken that experience with me on many projects these last few years, turning other skeptical developers into believers. Besides things like Helix, sometimes I see best practices go out the window when it comes to Sitecore, even though Sitecore actually makes it easier to use them. Maybe it's ignorance or laziness. I've been guilty of both. Solid principles are still worth thinking about and adhering to. If you don't know what SOLID stands for, please look it up, as they're very good. They're very key to good object-oriented design. But I will talk about a few principles that are key to good Sitecore development. The S in SOLID stands for single responsibility, in that each class you create should be responsible for one thing. This, to me, is the key to good design, and I hate the smell of classes that are responsible for way too much. Too often do I find way too much business logic in controller classes when making use of business objects and repositories will be much cleaner and more maintainable. The D stands for dependency inversion, which promotes decoupling modules, stating that high-level modules should not depend on low-level modules. Both should depend on abstractions. This is usually achieved through the dependency injection pattern. Dependency injection is a pattern to allow your application to inject objects on the fly to classes that need them without forcing those classes to be responsible for those objects, allowing your code to be more loosely coupled. Sitecore actually has had a built-in dependency injection container since version 8.2. So if you're creating repositories that get data or run queries, you can inject those objects into your component controllers without having to hard code that dependency. This has been a best practice in .NET for years, and XXA actually promotes it, using it as examples for creating custom controller renderings. It also makes it easier to write automated unit tests, which is another best practices I've seen resistance to, but we'll leave that for a discussion for another day. Design patterns are also worth understanding. I find myself thinking of some of the patterns that Sitecore employs that makes it so flexible. Take pipelines, for instance. Sitecore allows you to change the behavior, how things are done, using a giant chain of responsibility pattern. Add an HTTP begin request handler processor to inject your own code into each request using a patch file and make sure your code runs at the right time. You can even create your own Sitecore pipelines that provide that same level of configurability. If you got a multi-step process, or just want to give other modules the ability to modify behavior, this becomes a very powerful technique. I've used it to make Sitecore more configurable. Sometimes you need to extend Sitecore's link provider. If you're working with buckets and need to rewrite URLs, you need a custom link provider implementation to output the proper URLs for your bucket. Although Sitecore lets you replace the link provider to do this, you end up kind of stuck if you have more than one bucket and more than one set of rules, as you need to manage everything in one class. which is against Helix dependency management principles. The best way to solve this problem is to build a link provider that uses a custom pipeline to do that URL mapping. This way you can create pipeline processors for each mapping rule you need to create. If you're using Helix, you can put that processor in the foundation, and each feature can register its own processor with its own mapping rules, allowing you to manage dependencies cleanly. The observer pattern is another design pattern baked into Sitecore via events. Sitecore events allow you to respond to many fundamental activities like item saving and publishing, and are backed by the event queue to even support remote communications. You can create your own events with your own data and subscribe to them as remote events on remote servers. I've used this approach to force cache clears on third-party data. If you have a third party send a message to your CM server to let them know that data is no longer up to date, the CM server can just raise that as a custom event. Then all your CD servers are configured to listen for that as a remote event and respond with a custom event handler to clear their local caches. Pretty straightforward. Another built-in option to consider, although it's an area I haven't used in anger, is leveraging Sitecore's Rebus message bus. Having worked with BizTalk more than I'd like to admit, I do appreciate the pub-sub architecture, and service buses are a great approach to employ. The Sitecore message bus implementation is primarily used by EXM, but can be used for other messages as well, and given the right scenario, would be worth exploring. So to summarize, just because it's a CMS doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about both Sitecore and .NET best practices when building your solution. Pitfall number 2 is that Sitecore can and should do everything. Now, I love Sitecore, I really do. And this is definitely one I've been guilty of over the years. Especially when you're new to Sitecore, it feels like you have a new hammer and everything is a nail. Sitecore is not a database. I've seen attempts to make it one, particularly around user-generated content like blog comments. It may be great to have everything managed in Sitecore, but workarounds to try to push content from CD servers to CM servers are just too convoluted, and you're better off writing a custom table, or better yet, integrating a third-party solution like Discuss. Sitecore is also not great for collaboration. I've worked with clients who have moved away from SharePoint, and when it's more of an intranet scenario, it works extremely well. But if you have document libraries and you're still trying to manage them across multiple people, they may be better off in SharePoint. You can always reference them from Sitecore items and build an integration to automate that if needed. Sitecore Search does an okay job. For simpler requirements and even basic site search, it does the job. But once you start getting really involved with relevancy, adding boosting rules, thinking about personalization, and trying to optimize it, you should be looking at using a third-party solution like Coveo. It supports things like machine learning and gives you analytics that would be difficult to get without. I built an intranet solution that allowed employees to open help desk tickets, and it was able to tell you what search terms were leading to the most support tickets. This let them know what KB articles needed to be focused on to improve case deflection. This would be very difficult to build with Sitecore alone. And it's not just search. There are best-of-breed solutions for DAMs, PIMs, and commerce that come with ready-to-go integrations that will save you tons of time and frustration to try to build it without them. Data integrations are an area where we tend to make mistakes, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of data that changes frequently. When dealing with external data, your first inclination is probably to get that data into Sitecore. This way, you have your typical Sitecore API for building components, for indexing, for searching, and displaying them on your site. And sometimes that's the right answer. But if the data is not edited in Sitecore, will never need to be personalized, or addressed with their own URLs, it's probably not worth the cost or management of the import process and complexity of keeping the data in sync. If you can get by with API calls, even adding a caching layer, you'll end up with less problems. I've even gone the shadow copy route where you create stub items with names and IDs that you could use to drive API calls so that you have something in Sitecore but don't need to manage data inconsistencies. I even went down the data provider route once. In Sitecore, everything is configurable. You can change the backing for how items are stored. Instead of letting Sitecore manage data in SQL, you can write your own provider and store it wherever you want. Instead of syncing a bunch of content items, you can write a provider to call APIs and read and write data directly to a third-party system. This is actually how Sitecore Commerce and other commercial PIM connectors typically do it. You know, companies with the resources to handle the complexities of dealing with the performance implications, the caching and publishing edge cases that need to be bulletproof to make that work properly. And that's how I learned just because you can doesn't mean you should, as we eventually abandon that route to go more traditional sync process. So in summary, Sitecore is awesome, but it's just one tool in your belt. In your belt. Pitfall number 3 is not thinking through analytics, personalization, and tracking. So companies buy Sitecore because it's more than a CMS. It's an experience platform. They get hooked on the demos with personalization, A/B testing, and analytics. But when it comes time to design a component, you're usually just focused on the functional requirements and just getting it to work. And you may miss thinking through how will that component be personalized, or how can it collect data that will allow other components to be personalized. With component-based architecture being more of a norm, I don't really see many issues where components aren't built to properly consume data sources to support personalization, but I do sometimes see the scope of that personalization not being optimized. Sometimes you end up with components that are too large or should be broken up to be more discrete so that they're simpler and can support personalization easier. I do see a lot of components not really ready to support analytics, tracking, and goals. For components that have multiple states or deal with complex user behavior, you should be raising page events or goals that could be configured with engagement value by marketers. This will at least give them the option to indicate how valuable the use of your component is. Search is a great example of something that needs to be trackable. You can actually raise a page event in Sitecore that captures the search term, and Sitecore will automatically feed it to one of the Experience Analytics dashboard reports. Out-of-the-box search components like XXA and Coveo handle this properly, but I find it's an easy miss if you're building a custom search solution. With complex components or custom spot implementations, there may have been no consideration for how to report on user behavior of that component. If you're building a spot today, I would consider JSS as it makes it easier to do that, but for spas built without it, you should be thinking through what events are worth raising and ensuring your service layer can support them. And it doesn't help that before JSS, Sitecore didn't really have a good answer to client-side tracking other than create your own endpoints to do what you need. I actually built an open source project to expose an endpoint to generically allow you to fire goals and campaigns from client-side JavaScript. I even tried to work out how you can report on a client-side event as a full-blown interaction so it would properly feed the path analyzer tool. It can be done. One last thing on tracking. I see way too many integrations with third-party systems that send visitor data away without saving anything to Sitecore. Yeah, it probably meets the functional requirements, and you may not have a need for that data immediately, but if you don't persist anything to the visitor's profile, if you don't create contact facets to collect that data, you won't be able to use it for personalization. And maybe you don't need to store all of it. Maybe you have PII or HIPAA restrictions to consider, but some data is better than no data. In summary, by making sure you collect whatever data you can, capture events and goals in your components, you allow for profiling, personalization, optimization that would not be possible without it. Pitfall number 4 is having an inconsistent content author experience. I find too often we're laser focused on the visitor experience and don't think through the content author experience. While most projects have detailed functional specs and annotated wireframes explaining how components will work, I've seen very few that provide requirements that describe how content authors are going to configure their components. I always recommend thinking through and providing that level of guidance. However, it's hard to get a business analyst who understands Sitecore well enough to detail this, and most clients don't know what to ask for. Without solid requirements, I think the most important thing is consistency. Pages and components should work the same when it comes to assigning and organizing data sources, handling rendering parameters, and supporting the experience editor. If things are not consistent, it impacts the overall usability and ends up increasing the total cost of ownership. If you think of the life of a site, most of the costs come down to maintaining it, not building it. I did an assessment recently for a client with 20 to 30 sites that were built by different agencies over the years. Each site was built using a different set of standards. Some supported Experience Editor, others required Content Editor for everything. There were some components where you actually needed to switch between both to get things working. And although there was documentation, most of this actually became tribal knowledge. And it took them forever to onboard a new content author. So while consistency is key, I have a few standards I usually push. Data sources should follow a consistent information architecture, like supporting shared site and tenant content, or just storing content under the page item. Everything should support Experience Editor. Add a custom experience button to make things more editable where it's needed. Use rendering parameters to support things like custom CSS classes in a consistent way across components. Think through placeholder settings and how components are selectable, especially if you're not using a component library like XXA. I've used open source modules that override the default kitchen sink component selector with a tabbed interface to make things easier on content authors. Configure things like compatible renderings where they make sense. And set the defaults for caching so it's easy to fall into success. In summary, think about the content author and make their jobs as easy as possible is the best way to ensure the overall success of a project. Pitfall number 5 is not allowing for configurability. And I'm not just talking about leveraging configuration best practices like using Sitecore settings and patch files instead of app settings in your web config. I'm talking about truly allowing for configurability of your components and solutions within Sitecore itself. While environmental settings are probably worth keeping in config files and controlling values through configuration transforms in your DevOps process, you should think through the common types of config changes and how you best support them without requiring a deployment and subsequent app pull recycle. Usually that's a configuration item or set of items in your site or your place of choice. I have put things under system settings on occasion. You can use Sitecore security to ensure only those who should change them actually can, and you can create a configuration class that provides a static type access to those configured values. Usually it's an item with a template with all the settings related to the site or a feature you're working on. I had one client that had more complex requirements. They had sites and settings that needed to be cascaded and overridden depending on the context. So I actually built a multi-level tenant site setting configuration system where you had folders with a collection of items based on simple templates that had key value pairs. Content administrators could use the same keys at both the tenant and site levels, and the code was basically a dictionary facade that was smart enough to fetch settings from the tenant and override them with values from the site based on the context if it was overridden there. But it's not always global settings that you should be thinking about configurability for. You should also be thinking about configurability of your components. I'm a big fan of using rendering parameters for controlling component behavior. Things that aren't related to the content itself, but how the component behaves are better for that. I've seen plenty of cases where you're building a component to leverage a jQuery plugin or a custom JavaScript library, and it's basically hard-coded to one configuration, instead of parameterizing and mapping options to provide flexibility in the future. Another option to consider when it comes to configurability is using the Sitecore rules engine, where it makes sense. It's intuitive, yet powerful for content authors, and not that difficult to integrate with custom code. One of my favorite uses is to allow content authors to add rules to drive filtering and sorting of a content search API query, which is pretty easy to do using the rules field type and the out-of-the-box search query builder rule set. And there you can see it makes it very easy for them to add filters and set sorting options. One other recommendation for making things configurable is boosting rules. I find that clients don't really understand what they want when it comes to search relevancy until they see it. And instead of going through a lot of trial and error, allow your boost values to be driven from configuration items so they can tune and adjust instead of having to rely on developers to test and deploy. In summary, thinking through what levers and options you will enable lead to a much more robust and maintainable solution. Pitfall number 6 is ignoring out-of-the-box services and abstractions. As a developer, I get that you want to control things. And I get the inclination to write a service to just get data from Sitecore in the exact form and way that you want it. But I suspect that there are many cases where we could have just used one of the out-of-the-box APIs to do the same thing. And if you're like me, no code is the best kind of code. I attribute more to ignorance than malice. I think the problem is that we haven't spent the time to understand what the out-of-the-box options do, and not that they don't meet our needs. Because the thing is, Sitecore actually has solved the problem of getting content out of Sitecore in many different ways already. So before you write another simple API service that does little more than search through the content tree, returning specific items, I urge you to understand what the out-of-the-box options do, and only go custom if you really need to. The OData item service is a read-only JSON service that allows you to pull details about an item or items, or even run simple content searches. Unless you have a need for the OData format, I probably use the normal REST item service endpoint, which is much more robust. It supports creating, updating, and deleting items as well, has support for rich content search queries, including faceting, and even allows you to reference a Sitecore item that has the query configuration. So you can avoid putting all those details in the query string and just reference the item ID. The nice thing about both of these endpoints is that Sitecore has thought through things like security and scalability. You can create API keys under system settings and control how they are throttled. Things I'm sure you haven't considered for your own custom endpoints. And while I'm on custom endpoints, although you can use straight ASP.NET Web API and inherit their base controller, you should be leveraging Sitecore's Service API controller so you can leverage the same security model Sitecore uses on its endpoints. If you want to more closely follow the style of item service with your own business objects, you can build your own entity service, which is a requirement for supporting certain Speak components if you're building a custom Speak application. Lastly, back to your out-of-the-box service options. JSS shipped with a GraphQL endpoint, which I admittedly haven't used in Anger yet, though I find GraphQL pretty intuitive from an API perspective. I know it's also extensible with your own schemas and can be used without JSS. Here's a comparison table I put together for item-related APIs you can consider. But it's not just content that supports out-of-the-box APIs. XConnect itself is just a bunch of APIs related to working with XDB. The layout service gives you details about presentation details. XXA adds additional endpoints. There are many others, some of which that aren't fully documented. Once I tried to enable Swagger in Sitecore for that generic analytics service I mentioned earlier. Once you get past the configuration issues, which weren't too bad, you'll see there are actually a ton of services available. As a side note, Swagger is definitely something I recommend exploring. It really helps in documenting your APIs. Anyway, my advice to you is to understand the out-of-the-box APIs where you can and only go custom if you really need to. Pitfall number 7 is not planning for failure. I'm a positive person. I usually hope for the best. But things will inevitably go wrong. Errors you did not expect. Edge cases you did not know about. Dealing with the chaos monkey. There are big problems that you can't do much about. Data center outages. Disaster recovery planning is all about the trade-off of cost and recovery time. Luckily, most implementations I see these days are in the cloud, so you have more DR options as long as you have deep enough pockets. And the cloud providers have gotten more reliable. I remember going live with a fairly large Sitecore instance in Azure IaaS years ago before PaaS ARM templates became the norm. We were hit with multiple Azure-wide outages within a 2-month span. Very stressful, and as we were having discussions about maybe moving to AWS, AWS itself had a pretty large outage. So we ended up staying on Azure, and we didn't really have any regrets for that. Anyway, it's usually not the large outage you need to be concerned with. It's the critical errors that go unnoticed, the misconfiguration that has a business impact. We had this website with a critical lead form. Every time a visitor signed up, it was basically converting hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And every time it was submitted, we just sent the data to a third party for processing. The site went live, everything was going good. Few leads per day were coming across. A couple months later, the leads completely stopped coming in. Went a couple of weeks. Client initially thought it was a marketing problem, but after testing the form and not getting any errors, the lead never showed up in the backend system. Turns out there was a deployment done shortly before the lead stopped coming in. It accidentally set the service URL to the QA endpoint. So the leads were flowing, but not going to the right system. No one thought through how critical that form was, or thought what checks needed to be put in place to validate that it wasn't misconfigured. But it happens, and it won't happen again. The other thing I find is overlooked is error monitoring. When was the last time you looked at your Sitecore application log? It's one of the first things I'll do on a Sitecore assessment. I love playing the game. How many XConnect errors can I ignore? But environmental errors aside, what about your custom components and integrations and errors they log? Is anyone paying attention? Log4net is actually pretty robust. You can configure separate log files for your code and can even have different handlers to send errors elsewhere. You can even send emails if you want it. But that's probably not too scalable. That's where tools like AppDynamics and New Relic really shine. Set up rules and send alerts and properly manage them. And set up site health checks that will ping your site and tell you if they're still up. I've used New Relic Synthetics tool for one project and set up health checks from across the world to let us know not only if the site was up, but whether it was performing well. Performance is very important. A slow site is as good as a broken one. And though monitoring tools can help you determine where the bottlenecks are, you should be able to flush out issues while still in development. When was the last time you used the Sitecore debugger? It's actually a very useful tool that's available in Experience Editor. You can enable it and it'll give you a line-by-line set of metrics that tell you where all your code is spending its time. I actually wrote a similar trace logger that allows you to sample and send similar data to your Sitecore log. It's available on my GitHub and on NuGet. Anyway, in summary, expecting things to go wrong is the best way to prepare for it. Pitfall number 8 is not automating your deployments. My two biggest pet peeves on a project is not having a well-documented, clean local environment setup and not having automated build setup. For some reason, I think these are correlated. Probably because if it's convoluted to get your local environment set up, your shared environments have little chance. I've been involved in way too many projects where it took days to get up and running with a local environment. There was one project that had gotten so bad that the team didn't trust the TDS projects it has, and instead shipped database backups to new developers. If you can't get a local development machine up without relying on backups, you're clearly doing something wrong. Because DevOps with Sitecore is attainable. Unicorn and TDS can both be integrated into your build process to make sure your templates can be versioned and deployed with your code. You should not be dependent on manual packaging. That's another practice I've seen done way too much. Manual packaging of content and templates to support deployments is tedious and error-prone. I've worked with large companies with strict controls on deployments. You need to open tickets with instructions to the deployment team with attachments of what needed to be deployed. At first, the packaging was done manually, and inevitably there were missing templates and content items. And since deployment windows were usually late at night, the team was left scrambling, tired and frustrated. It should not be that difficult. I'm convinced that if you don't spend time at the beginning of a project getting this right, you'll spend much more time throughout the project handling things manually. And it's not just about production. Continuous integration and deployment to dev make the overall development process smoother. Here's what I generally recommend for projects. Pull requests for development are configured with a gated check-in, ensuring it won't merge if it won't compile. Once approved, it should automatically start a deployment to dev. I will usually have a separate branch for staging and production, so a lead will need to do a manual PR between dev and staging, which will automate a deployment to the QA or staging environment. The difference for prod will be that once that QA has validated the deployment on stage, the same build artifacts get used to push the release to production. Content, code, everything, the same. Only configuration transforms are different and handled by the deploy process. So to recap, having a strong automated build and deploy process is not just nice to have, it's critical. Pitfall number 9 is ignoring PowerShell extensions. I'm not sure why I've seen developers hesitant to use PowerShell extensions. Maybe it's the fact it's PowerShell, which I promise you isn't terribly different than C#. Maybe it's that it's an external module, but it's not going anywhere. XXA makes extensive use of it and has some level of support from Sitecore. And there's a pretty comprehensive Git book with documentation for it. I think it should be your go-to when it comes to custom reporting. Besides having a number of out-of-the-box reports, it makes it very easy to write code that gets data from Sitecore or even external data and displays it in a Sitecore grid that allows you to export the data to many formats, including Excel. I wrote a blog post recently about a script I wrote to go through a site to see what templates and components were actually used on the site, which helped in an assessment I was doing to understand how complex their site was. The other area I think it needs serious consideration is as a replacement for custom Speak applications. Speak has always been more complex than I would have liked, and the fact that PowerShell allows you to create custom dialogues and wire them up to menus and ribbons without dealing with Speak components or JavaScript is awesome. All of the XXA dialogues are built using it. The wizards that create tenants and sites are all built using PowerShell dialogues. The effort to understand and wire up Speak components versus PowerShell dialogues is not insignificant. I also usually recommend PowerShell for building simple data integrations or data migration scripts. If it's a one-time or limited migration that doesn't require the configurability or that a more robust solution like the Data Exchange Framework provides, or require the complexity of fully managed code, PowerShell can usually get the job done. In summary, don't be afraid of PowerShell. Pitfall number 10 is avoiding the ecosystem. Now, I define the ecosystem as all the features that are not part of this core CMS platform, as well as community and open source. I'm talking about avoiding things like Sitecore Experience Accelerator and Email Experience Manager. I personally experienced issues with EXM during some of the V8 revisions. And XXA today is much more mature than when it first came out many years ago. But not seriously considering using XXA for a new project is probably a disservice. And that's because it's more than just a set of components. It's an architecture and set of standards. Even if you don't use any of the out-of-the-box components, you'll build a better site leveraging the tenant and site information architecture, page designs, partials, and rendering variants. Not to mention not having to worry about things like sitemaps, redirection rules, and robots.txt files. Besides PowerShell, I see resistance to other widely used open source projects. I've seen resistance to moving to Unicorn, particularly from folks who are very used to using TDS, but I can attest to its maturity. I still love using Glass despite the pain of moving between version 4 and version 5. Granted, there is some debate to the usefulness of an ORM with Sitecore and XXA in particular, but I do find value in it when leveraging the classes as business objects. The Sitecore marketplace has lots of goodness, though I know it's hard to find things, and even harder to find things that support a specific Sitecore version. But most modules can be found on GitHub, and you can either use the module as is or steal whatever parts of the code you think you need. Looking at code is a great way to learn about Sitecore. Anyway, the point is the Sitecore community is made up of a ton of great people who put their work into the public. We're already building on the shoulders of giants using Sitecore, and we can prop ourselves even higher on top of the community. So before I get off my soapbox, I wanted to summarize the major points. I recommend everybody embrace best practices: Helix, solid principles, design patterns, dependency injection, pipelines. All your .NET best practices are just as relevant in Sitecore. Leverage Sitecore for what it does best. Add unnecessary complex integrations and consider the maintainability and data integrity of your solutions. Empower the customer experience. Support analytics and personalization with custom components and make things trackable. Have a consistent author experience. Use consistent information architecture and support the experience editor to make sure your content authors know what to look for and how to use your components. Make things configurable. Use configuration items in the rules engine to give your users better control over the solution. Use the out-of-the-box APIs. Consider using the OData or the item service or even leveraging JSS GraphQL capabilities. Think about instrumentation and monitoring. Make sure you're logging what you need to troubleshoot common problems. Think about alerts and monitoring. Automate your deployments. Streamline the delivery of your code and templates through all of your environments. Use PowerShell extensions for reports, data migration as a replacement for custom speak applications. And embrace shared modules and community source, from XXA, EXM to open source modules supported by the awesome Sitecore community. Thank you.